Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to talk about some interesting poetry that I have learned about and watched on other people's channels, although I selected a different poem not related to that person's channel. But yeah, today I want to talk about Nazis and the effects of World War II. I am referring to Clothes by Edgar Bowers. For those who don't know, Edgar Bowers is an American poet living between 1924 and the year 2000. He wrote poetry and other writings, and he also served during World War II, which is something that shows up pretty frequently in his poetry, remarking on sort of an existentialist kind of quandary that happened with the war. He also wrote about life and memory and loss and all those kinds of things, studying under another poet named Ivor Winters, who I don't really know who that is, but it seems to be like an important person to Edgar at least. And he got some notoriety for his work as well. And so what really drew me to Edgar Bowers is Poetry Crone, another YouTube channel, booktube channel, where she seems to talk exclusively about poetry. And she cataloged Edgar Bowers pretty recently, and his poetry made me feel a great many different emotions, and I was like, I gotta talk about this person. I gotta find more of their work, and here I am talking about a poem that she did not catalog on her channel. I wanted to make sure that there was enough difference there, so I'm gonna link to her channel in the description so that you may find it and learn more about poetry there. But yeah, without further ado, let's talk about Clothes. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. Clothes. Walking back to the office after lunch, I saw Hans. Mr. Isham, Mr. Isham. He called out in his hurry, Herr Wegner needs you. A woman waiting for a border pass took poison. She is dead. And the police are there to take the body. In the hall, the secretary stood outside their doors, silently waiting with Wegner. Sir, he said, it was her answer on the questionnaire, a clerk for the Gestapo. So it was. Within the outer office, by the row of wooden chairs, one lying on its side, on the discolored brown linoleum floor under a GI blanket, was the lost, unmoving shape, uncovered from a fold, a dirty foot half out of a dirty shoe. Once white, heel bent, the sole worn through the skin, bruised red and calloused, uncut toenails curved and veined like an old ivory. No one spoke. Police stood at attention by a stretcher. After an empty moment, suddenly bent over as if taken by a cramp, I sobbed out loud, and on my uniform vomited up my lunch, over the tie, the polished buttons and insignia, the little strips of color, and the green Eisenhower jacket with its eagle patch, the taut pants and a crease, the glistening jump boots. Vomiting and still sobbing like a child, awakened in the night and sick, Wegner and Hans held me, murmuring, Ach, dear sir, the war is over and not over. Oh, such things happen. While no one else moved, Frau Schmidt brought a towel to clean me off before Hans walked me back, my arm across his shoulders, and I retelling the story of how, near Zell MC, we found hung from a tree in leaf the final sack of bones in rotted Wehrmacht green. In the house an SS lord had furnished for his mistress, deep sofas, Persian rugs, and velvet drapes, Frau Koenig took my clothes. In my own room, wearing the Gucci robe Bucard had taken from a fine house before we got to Ulm, instead of lying down to rest, I studied the book I read for German with Frau Schmidt, Goethe's Italian Journey. Through the window, the watchman's upper slopes were shadows, green and purple with the afternoon, its snows melting, its double peaks the victory sign. in terms of analysis, that was closed, and there's a fair bit worth talking about with the poem. In terms of narrative, the narrator is working for the army. He's talking about Mr. Isham. Mr. Isham, or Mr. Isham is his name. He's called out. He's told that a woman took her own life after being found out that she had worked for the Gestapo. Presumably, that would have meant something terrible for her. I believe that the person in question, Mr. Isham, is a military man based on how his dress is. He ends up seeing the body and vomiting over it, thinking more about the war and the terrible things that he saw. And then looking out of the window at the end of the story, or at the end of the poem, and seeing the mountains and thinking they're in the shape of a victory sign. So this poem is very much about the war, World War II specifically, and that might be based on, as I mentioned in the introduction, Edgar Bauer's own experiences in the war. I think the big idea that Bowers is trying to highlight in this poem is the lingering nature of World War II. It was only 4 or 5 years long, or 6, depending on if you count like the entirety of it. Of course, you would count the entirety of it, but it was only 6 years long, but its effects have lingered for quite a long time. As Hans says after Mr. Isham kind of vomits, he says, "Ach, dear sir, the war is over, and not over such things happen." What does it mean for the war to be over and not over? It means that it went on for some time, and so the effects have lingered, as I just mentioned. But they linger, and that people are still connected to the war. What's interesting is I believe that Wegener and Hans are described in another Edgar Bowers poem, and I think they might have worked for the Nazis at one point before changing sides, or just the war just ending. So even though the war is over, you still have Nazi things coming up, perhaps with Hans or Wegener's own beliefs coming to play, but most likely that you're encountering citizens who had once worked for the Gestapo, and that might affect their prospects after the war. And still Mr. Isham still kind of remembers what happened during the war. He tells the story of what he saw near Zell am See, where he saw a sack of bones, and it says in rotted Wehrmacht green. I don't know if that was a Nazi hung from a tree, or someone dressed up in Nazi clothing who might have been one of the victims of the Nazis. But it's a really disturbing sight, and that has clearly remained on the narrator's mind, so for them the war is over, but it's also not over. That it's likely this trauma is going to remain with them for a long time, and indeed World War II, the trauma of that has remained with this entire world for a very long time, if you think about it. Just one other thing I want to note about this poem and how very interesting it is. Because I felt like it was flowing very naturally, so I counted out the syllables, and each line of poetry is 10 or 11 syllables long, between 9 to 11, generally averaging out 10 or so, indicating that this is in some sort of pentameter, which is pretty amazing that he's able to do that and make it flow. And given that it's partially a story, it really helps the poem stand out, and it flows through, and it's syllabic or something like that. So it's the use of words and language in such a way that it's finely tuning the poem. But he later goes on to break it in other poems. He doesn't exactly follow the verse as it would be. And I think Poetry Crone even highlighted some of those poems. So even though he is very much capable of doing that, he's also capable of breaking the rules. And I think it makes for an interesting style that he uses. It makes his poems a little bit more memorable. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Closed by Edgar Bowers. A good poem, one that is it's worth reading along with the rest of his collection. He has a very interesting way of telling stories within his poetry that doesn't really feel like poetry, but it is. It's very flowy and very beautiful, sometimes even very poignant in what he's trying to talk about, given that he's talking about World War II and other such thoughts. So I'm going to put a link to it in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to go check out Poetry Crone's channel. I'll put a link to that in the description too. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem or this poet or Poetry Thursday if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and World War II travels. Farewell.